All right. Just a little bit of trouble. LinkedIn is such a great idea, but I don't know about you all, but I just do not find a lot of value in LinkedIn. I get spammed a lot. I get a zillion people wishing me a happy anniversary for my different employment statuses, stati, however you say that plurally, and yet no interaction with those folks. And this is not a knock on anybody. I just, and now when I try to go live on LinkedIn, they're like, yeah, you're not approved. Okay, I'm not approved. That's fine. I just don't understand LinkedIn. That's all. We're waiting on Tim Furnish, Dr. Tim Furnish. He's been on the show several times. You can see his, let's see, where's it at? It's over here. You can see his, I can't get this mirror thing down. I'd be a terrible pilot if I had to use controls in reverse. So we're going to have Dr. Tim Furnish on. Here's his book. His latest book. And if you're into counterinsurgency at all, it's called The Coin of the Islamic Realm. And basically, it's a history of the Ottoman Empire from 1416 to 1916. And there's a lot of stuff in it. If you know about anything about the Ottoman Empire, which I know a little about. Matter of fact, here's how little in general Western folks know about the Turkish Empire. When you read the articles on Wikipedia, like if that's where you start to find source material, then you go find that stuff. The English is so terrible in the articles because they got to be straight translations, computer translations from the Turkish side over to the English side. And so it's just not something that we commonly talk about. And so it's good that Tim wrote this book. I'm trying to see if there's a status from him here. Let's see here. We'll send him a text. Aha, there he is. Just in time. Hey, Tim, how are you?
Hang on, Pete. Get my sound up.
Okay, get your sound up. I'll continue to fill time. So you were talking about how to understand the Ottoman Empire, one has to do quite a bit of research. And I went to Wikipedia to try to look things up to find source materials. And even those articles are written, obviously translated by a computer of some kind, because they're not truly in English. And you can see that, and you'll appreciate this, Tim, you'll see that Islamic writing where there's all the extra glorification of things and the honorific titles and things you have to say when you say someone's name, or just their style of writing, and it comes through. And that's how unknown a lot of this stuff is for us folks, because we just don't know the Ottoman/Turkish story. How's your sound coming, Tim?
It's good. I got it. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Why don't you say these words? You say, this is Dr. Tim Furnish, and you're watching the Break It Down Show.
This is Dr. Tim Furnish, and you're watching the Break It Down Show.
Welcome, Tim, once again coming here. Here's his book, The Coin of the Islamic Realm. It's a history from 1416 to 1916 that Tim has done. And Tim's got a fantastic pedigree. By the way, Tim, if you look over this shoulder here, your name's in lights. How great is that?
Wow, finally, my life goal has been realized.
Yes, yeah. First off, am I right in assuming that we just don't know that much about the Ottoman Empire in terms of in the popular, like we know a lot about World War II. We know that the Turks probably fought in it, probably aren't sure which side they fought on. And then if we go any further back, it starts to fade really fast on what we know about the Ottomans. We know that they were the sick man of Europe, but that's it. That's where it stops.
Yeah, and that's even a late 19th, early 20th century caricature. There's a lot more to it than that, as you point out. We're talking at least 500 years of an empire. It's like, as I point out in the I always forget what those things are called. Forward, preface, whatever the heck, preface. Yeah, I always get those confused. I pointed out a number of years ago, one of my sons in his world history class, which they were taking in like 5th grade. And I said, hey, let me see your history book. And it was like, it talked about World War I. It didn't even mention the Ottomans, as if they weren't even in the war. So, and I pointed out, you run into this a lot. It's like it became a field of history that was sort of like, I don't want to say ghetto, but it was very highly specialized, I guess you could say. Mm-hmm. And I'm by no means an Ottomanist. I mean, I'm, as I point out in the book, I'm sure you saw, I'm a fan of Bernard Lewis, and I think to be a Middle East expert, or to be a China expert, you probably need to know Mandarin. To be a Russian expert, you probably need to know Russian. to be a Middle East, to style yourself as a Middle East expert, you need more than a degree in fine arts. You need you need access to some of the primary sources. And I'm primarily an Arabic. That's my main language. I did study Ottoman, but Ottoman is incredibly, incredibly difficult. And I finally just decided, since I knew Arabic going to grad school, I'd kind of punt and go with Arabic. But I did take a lot of Ottoman classes from a couple of the premier Ottomanists in the country, Carter Finley and Jane Hathaway at Ohio State. So I think I probably know more about the Ottomans than the average bear does. And then, I'm sorry, I jump ahead of you, Pete, but then basically what I worked 5.5 years in the J2 down in SOCOM with the SOCOM folks. And so I realized, of course, counterterrorism, countersurgery is kind of a big field. And I realized that, all the studies, whenever you look in this field, it's like, well, we look at what we did or the Brits did or the French did. And sometimes we'll look at, we'll look at, maybe the Egyptians in Yemen in the 60s when they got in there, kind of, it was a quagmire for them. But nobody ever has really looked at how the Ottomans did this. And so I just thought, well, there's, I kind of bring the two facets of what I'd been engaged in together and try to do something about it.
Yeah, and thanks for doing that too. We also had Tim McIntosh on, who basically is a reporter, but lived in Yemen for a long, long time and wrote the 3,000-year history of the Arabs, and it's just his tome. And you have to have a command of a lot of things just to enter into the waters of that book, because the names are different, the places are different, the history is completely different, and so you lack so much context. It's a real deliberate read, and I found myself struggling with yours too, just because like the name Mehmet is all over the place, and I don't know what a pasha is, and I've heard the word
Right.
Grand Vizier, but I don't know what the hell that So there was so much context that I needed when I read the book, and you gave it. I mean, you explained a lot of these things, but just the roots of learning this stuff must have been challenging for you.
Yeah, and again, it's in graduate. I was an Arabic linguist in the Army before I went to graduate school. So then I went to graduate school, and I took, besides taking 4 more years of Arabic, I took 2 years of Persian, 2 years of Farsi, 2 years of modern Turkish, and then I took it's actually, Ohio State was still in quarters then. I took 2 or 3 quarters of Ottoman, which just will make you go blind. I mean, I could struggle through Ottoman. You literally sometimes with these Ottoman texts, because they wrote so small, you really literally had to use a magnifying glass to read the text. And
they must have really good eyes back then.
Yes, and I've worn glasses since the 5th grade. I'm like, I don't need my vision to get any worse. And as I said, I just kind of punted to the Arabic side and did my dissertation using Arabic sources. But I feel like I was familiar enough with Ottoman. But you're right, Pete. You can be well versed in, say, Arab history, and you might know next to nothing about the Ottomans, because it was not an entirely different world, but it was a different world. The documents are written differently. It was a different approach, and I think, and a lot of people, there's this sort of presentist. You get this, and I understand it. There's a sort of presentist tendency, prejudice, you could say, where, well, we just want to know what happened in recent years. We just want to know what happened since, I don't know, World War II, sometimes World War I, because, as you know, a lot of people probably don't. World War I is actually more relevant to the Middle East than World War II is, because there's still a lot of unresolved issues from World War I.
Yeah.
And the collapse of the Ottoman Empire there. So you'll get a lot of people that will know something about the modern world, and I ran into a number of works, quite good works, on insurgency and counterinsurgency in the Arab world. But no one, again, I found only one source, as I point out later in the book. One guy at the University of Louisville about 7 or 8 years ago did a master's thesis on Ottoman counterinsurgency, but it strictly dealt with World War I and with the Armenian issue. And so I was like, oh, there's a lot more to it than that. So again, I just used secondary sources, the best ones I can find, tried to go back and just take a very large sweeping look at this, and then fit how the Ottomans fought these rebellions, these insurgencies, into sort of the kind of paradigms we use today.
I guess we should do a little bit of homework then, since we've kind of colored how much is unknown about this. What is the Ottoman Empire? When did it begin? I mean, we can talk about Osman if you want. I'm not trying to get into the details.
The Ottoman Turks were the second major tribe of Turks to move in the Middle East. There was one before them called the Seljuks. So if you go back to the time of the Crusades, there was a group called the Seljuk Turks that ruled much of the Islamic domains. And yeah, the Turks, Turco-Mongol, really. The Turks are ethnically and linguistically related to the Mongols that come from Central Asia, a millennium or so ago. And as we went through after the creation of the major Islamic empires like the Abbasids, back before the first millennium turned over, you had Turks coming in basically from Central Asia down toward the southwest, moving into the Islamic domains, and basically because they were nomadic warriors from the steppes, being recruited mainly as archers, horse cavalry. I'm sorry, it's redundant, cavalry. And eventually, some of these Turks wound up taking over. The Seljuks did this for a while. Eventually, another tribe of Turks came called the Osmandala Turks, because their founder was a guy named, or their leader was a guy named Osman, that gets turned into Ottoman by the French and the British. And the Ottomans came in at a time when the Byzantine Empire was falling apart. It's still, well, until the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, when they got their butts handed to them by the Seljuks. The Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, had started losing territory in Anatolia. And the Turks came in, the other Turks, the Ottomans, came in and took advantage of that, starting really in the 1300s. And it was kind of weird. People tend to think they came strictly from the east, but what they did was they came from the east and they sort of leapfrog across the Aegean over to Greece and Bulgaria and that area. And then they wound up, when they finally took out what was left of the Byzantines, which was the city of Constantinople in 1453, they actually came from both directions. So by 1453, the empire technically was established before that. They got a setback because some guy named Tamerlane came through and laid waste to them like he did to everybody. But they eventually reconstituted their state. And so really you have an Ottoman Empire. The date is usually given, the onset is 1453, because that's the date at which they took out Constantinople, which is what was left of the Byzantine Empire. So and then the Ottoman Turks rule that they wind up conquering much of the Middle East, not Iran, but they conquered almost all of the Arab Middle East. They conquered Egypt from the Mamluks in the early 16th century. They took over, of course, Arabia, because they were styling themselves, not unreasonably, as the leaders of the Sunni world. And so to do that, what you got to have Mecca and Medina. They conquered up into Europe. They besieged Vienna a couple times, never took it, but they ruled much of southeastern Europe for hundreds of years. An empire on three continents, and the ruling stratum, I should say, was Ottoman Turkish, but they ruled Arabs and Bulgars and Greeks and Kurds and lots of other different peoples, Egyptians, and for a while their rule extended across North Africa. That was really sort of more theoretical than it was in reality, but they did rule over till about Libya, I guess you could say. So, and it lasts till World War One. The Ottoman Empire lasts up until World War One, and it actually, a lot of people think it ends right at World War One, but it doesn't. The Ottoman Empire survived World War One, and actually the final Ottoman Sultan signed the peace treaty to end the war on their side, but it was such a negative peace treaty from the Turkish point of view that basically it sparked a rebellion in the empire, led by one of the generals, a guy named Mustafa Kemal, one of the few competent generals they had, and one of the generals of Gallipoli. And Mustafa Kemal eventually led the creation of the Turkish Republic. And they basically did away with the Ottoman state in the early 1920s. So the end date for the Ottoman Empire technically is 1924, when they finally got rid of the last caliph. They kept the caliph around as sort of a religious figurehead, but they eventually got rid of him in 1924. They didn't kill him; they sent him off to Paris. These Islamic leaders always get sent off to Paris. I don't know, something about Paris, I guess. But
let me jump in with the question here. So we get we're getting a sense for the length of all this stuff, 500 plus years, 700 years by some count, however you want to look. It's a long time. And like a lot of we'll call that, I don't know, what do you call it? It's not the ancient world, but the post Dark Ages, I guess you would call it.
Usually it's called the early modern world, medieval and early modern.
Medieval and early modern world. Yeah. It's rife with conflict. I mean, if you look at a time map, which I did this morning, of what the Ottoman Empire was or was trying to be, it's just fights all over the place. And the same thing is true going in the other direction. They're trying to hold off the Turks. They're trying to hold off the whatever it is. It was just a constant state of war for 500 plus years.
Conventional and unconventional, I guess we could say. because the Ottomans are going into Europe. I mean, there were very legitimate concerns in the 15th, 16th, 17th century that the Ottomans were going to conquer Europe. Luther even had a specific prayer for protection against the Turks.
I love it.
Yeah. And on the other side, the Ottomans are fighting with the various rulers of Iran, partly because of geopolitics, but also partly because of religion, because Iran was converted to Twelver Shiism by the Safavids starting in the early 16th century. So you had the preeminent Sunni state, which was the Ottomans, against the preeminent, or really the only, Twelver Shia state at the time, which was Persia or Iran under the Safavids and later the Qajars and other groups. So there's lots of warfare, and a lot of it's conventional warfare against outside enemies. The Ottomans are fighting the Russians. The Ottomans are fighting the Venetians. The Ottomans are fighting the Austro-Hungarians. Or the Polish winged hussars who showed up to save everybody's bacon at the second siege of Vienna. The massive naval battle of Lepanto in 1571. Between the Ottomans were trying to invade Rome. They were going to try and kill the Pope because they thought that would help things from their point of view. And the Catholics stopped fighting each other long enough to put together a flotilla to stop the Ottomans. But so you got all that going on the outside, and then again, as my book points out, also inside the empire, you got threats and rebellions and mutinies and insurgencies.
The logistical problems too, I noticed obviously we're following waterways. If you control the Nile, you control that portion of northern Africa. You have whichever sea you want it to be, whether it's the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea, all these different areas where if you had any kind of port system set up, you controlled that entire thing. There wasn't a Suez Canal to sneak through on the backside for most of the history of Turkey. Right. And so you were constantly seeing these smaller battles. And then, like you said, you've got to control. I mean, you don't have to control Najaf, but if you're going to go get Medina and, Mecca, you're going to get, these other places potentially too along the way because they have religious importance. Mm-hmm. But there's nothing out there. I mean, once you get south of Baghdad and you don't head towards Basra, you're effed in terms of supply, logistics. If that's a big, wide hunk of land, and we're not talking anywhere near the water, with these things.
Unlike with Yemen, two of the movements I deal with are Yemen. The Ottomans spent all told 159 years in Yemen trying to bring that place, to heal, and they also spent a number of years, directly and indirectly, through their proxy, the Egyptians, fighting the Wahhabis in Central Arabia. And I point out there seems to be a big difference between how the Ottomans fought in Yemen and how they fought in Central Arabia. And I think a lot of it just simply do, like you said, with logistics and staging area. Because how can you get to Yemen? Well, you can stage from Egypt and go right down the Red Sea, right across the Red Sea, and it's not that difficult, especially when you control Egypt like the Ottomans did. But once you get out into you head toward the Empty Quarter, or you head out into Central Arabia toward the Najd, it's not that easy, right? And so the Ottomans really had little recourse there. So it was easier for them to fight this counterinsurgency in Yemen, although it went on much longer than it was for them to fight the one in Central Arabia. Although, if you want to talk about this later, the one in Central Arabia actually was in many ways a bigger problem for them.
One of the other things I learned from Tim's book that was remarkable, this is Tim's McIntosh Smith, not you, Tim, was that the Bedouins especially were like the Mongols, very effective. They used a camel for personal porting, and then they had the horse for battle. And so they could cover these vast distances better than anybody else because they had mastered that. And so you for the audience, you imagine you've got something carrying your water. That's a camel. It's carrying your tent. It's carrying all of your shit, thousands of pounds of stuff potentially. And then you get to the battle, you're like, stay here, camel. And then you ride your horse at hyper fast speed into the fight. And then here's this caravan dude, I'm just trying to go from A to B. And they're like, you're dead, and there's nobody going to save you. Nobody going to stop you. Right. Nobody's even going to know you're missing until 3 months from now. And the fight will be over in an instant. And that's how hard it is to control that Central Arabian Peninsula.
Yeah. And the Ottomans found that out too. Although the Egyptians did quite well for a while, as I point out. They maybe had more experience with the desert than the Ottomans did.
Why Yemen? Why? I mean, it's so far from Constantinople, Istanbul, whatever you want to call it.
I think a couple of reasons. It was, that's the period in when the Europeans, not long after, by the 16th century, hadn't been much before that, maybe a century and a half, that the Europeans expanded into the Indian Ocean, starting with the Portuguese, right? and then the British and the Dutch, or maybe the Dutch and the British actually, but mainly the Portuguese. And so the Ottomans, who had had trade from Yemen, going across the Arabian Sea, even to India, they wanted to protect that trade. They had trade across the Red Sea from their important commodities coming in from Africa, ivory, gold, and slaves. You know, the Ottomans did a lot with slaves. So that trade was all important to them. And so they felt that it may have been threatened by the Portuguese and by other Europeans. And then there's the whole thing with the Ottomans were concerned about a threat to Mecca and Medina coming from the south. So it was both sort of economic and religious, I guess you could say.
The religious part is, I've been sort of waiting on this because it's such a big piece of this whole puzzle. But we think about Islam, maybe we can say Sunnah, maybe we can say Shia, and then we quickly lose sight of what it is. But it's not just a cleaved in half pretty schism. This thing is an absolute shit show and a mess.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, it's sort of like, you know, Europe and the 30 Years' War and European history. It's not just Protestant versus Catholic. It's a lot more complicated than that. Right. And sometimes Catholics help Protestants against other Catholics, and the other way around. You get the same sort of thing with the Ottomans. I mean, because ultimately all of the Ottomans are an Islamic state, and they rule to some degree that Islamic law is part of what they do and what they live by and rule by. Ultimately, they're still a major geopolitical power. And so politics sometimes, if not often, will trump religion. So a lot of the rebellions I talk about against the Ottomans were fellow Sunnis. The Wahhabis were Sunnis. Right. You know, the Qadi Azelis that I talk about quite a bit were Sunnis. But sometimes it was Shia, like in a complicating factor. I would argue probably not the primary factor, but a complicating factor for the insurgency in Yemen is the fact that the Zaydis in Yemen, who are still there, by the way, maybe we talk about that later, are what are called Fiver Shia. They're a brand of Shia. They're not exactly the same as Iran, which is 12er, but they were Shia, and one of their big beef with the Ottomans was not so much religion as it was simply that the Turks were seen as foreign occupiers by people who are Arabs. Religion was a complicating factor there. I think that's much causative. But and then you had like situations like the Druze in Lebanon and Syria. Now the Druze, by most Muslims, aren't even considered Muslims anymore. I mean, the Druze broke away from mainstream Islam about 1,000 years ago. They were actually Shia. They broke away from the Shia in the 11th, 12th century, and they actually divinized the last Fatimid caliph, a guy named Al-Hakam. Well, not the last Fatimid caliph, but the one who disappeared into the desert one day in the year 1009 or thereabouts. So the Druze, and there are, you can go back to Ibn Taymiyyah, who's a 14th century Sunni cleric. Ibn Taymiyyah wrote fatwas condemning the Druze as worse than Jews and Christians because they pretend to be Muslims and they're really not.
The worst.
Yeah, that's the worst kind, fake Muslim. So the Ottomans often had problems with the Druze in Lebanon and Syria, on and off for hundreds of years, until the French kind of came in and relieved them of the problem, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
So religion is sometimes directly causative in these situations, like this group I'm talking about with the Qadi Azelis. Qadi Azelis named after this guy, Qadi Zadeh, who was basically, it was only in the 17th century. It was mainly in Istanbul, also lesser degree in Cairo. And it really wasn't an insurgency. It's sort of a unique, of the 7 movements that I study, it's kind of a bit different in that they weren't trying to, I mean, it was in Istanbul. It was within the center of the empire. And it basically was a reform movement. It really was in many ways sort of like a fundamentalist Sunni reform movement. You know, they said that the empire needs to be more like this, more Islamic. We don't like some of the ways that the empire practices Islam. But that was a Sunni group. But so you had different kinds of challenges to the empire, and as I point out, you know, as a historian, I always point out that religion is a cause, and sometimes it's the main cause, but it's almost never the only cause. There's always economics and politics and geopolitics and class warfare, and all that stuff has to be. You have to look at that stuff too.
I want to spend a little bit more time on religion and try to give the audience a good grasp of this, because this is something that I struggle to try to characterize. So I'm going to try, and you're going to tell me I'm wrong and tell me the better way to do it. But when we think about all of the Druze, the Kadazeli, all of these different groups, in effect, we're talking about the ascension of the next imam. In a lot of cases, the fiver, the 12er, the seveners, all these different ers. Basically, it's like dynasties, and some group says that's where we're stopping this dynasty, but others are like, no, the dynasty continued to the 12th imam, or in my case, the 15th imam. It's all these different disagreements on what dynasty we're in and what rules we're going to follow. You know, are we allowed to drink coffee? I mean, Turkish coffee would be blasphemous in certain eras of the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah. Well, I think you're, and I'm not going to say you're wrong, Pete. Never tell the interviewer they're wrong. Okay, I've done enough to know that. But I will say I think you're kind of conflating two different things.
Okay.
You're conflating the sort of political thing of a dynasty with the Shia idea of the imams. And although the Shia imam idea can be a dynastic thing, like it was to some degree in Yemen with the fivers, you can have dynasties that are purely have nothing to do with the Shia. I mean, the Ottomans were a dynasty and they were Sunni.
Right.
They had nothing to do with the Shia.
Yeah.
So it's kind of two different things, I guess. So wait a minute, am I missing? Was there a question to that, or did you?
Well, just in general, I'm just trying to color for the audience, like why are there all these different groups? And I was trying to make the thing of saying these guys said like it was Jesus, and these guys said no, it was Ray who came after Jesus, and then they're like no, after Ray, his kid Charlie came along, and so we're all in support of Charlie, who's in the line of Jesus.
Yeah. Why are all these different groups in the Ottoman Empire? Well, you know, writ large, because it's one of the largest empires in the world. It covers a lot of territory. It's conquered a lot of people. So, I mean, that's sort of the Cliff Notes explanation now. But in terms of the groups you're talking about, yeah, I mean, the dynastic imperative is, I think, sort of the default position in human political history. I mean, you know, I teach world history too, and I talk about this a lot. You know, most of the pre-modern world, that's how you got your ruler. How did you generally become the king or the sultan or the emperor or the pharaoh? Your dad was the king or the emperor or the sultan or the pharaoh, or, you know, that's generally how it worked. And sorry, ladies, it was usually dad. I mean, sometimes it was dad, sometimes it was a daughter. I mean, like, you know, Henry spent all that time trying to produce a son, and then if he'd just known that Elizabeth was going to be so damn good, he probably wouldn't have worried about it so much, right?
Can I add a piece to your thing? Your dad was the king of the ruler, and also you weren't the guy your brother killed. You know,
exactly, right. Which is particularly true with certain periods with the Ottomans, because there was a really bloody tradition with the Ottomans. I shouldn't even say tradition; it became like the norm, I guess, or like a political imperative that, like, whatever Ottoman brother got the throne, he had all those brothers killed. Or, you know, if he was a nice guy, he'd just have them blinded, Pete. So that, you know,
what a sweetheart.
Yeah, you know, that's kinder, gentler way of dealing with your brothers. I mean, we look at this stuff with, like, you know, the kings of England or the kings of France. Oh, they had nothing on the Ottomans. If only because the Ottomans generally had more kids, because the Sultan had, you know, an entire harem to produce children. Although he was supposed to have one primary wife, or maybe at the most four primary wives. And you could never, and the next sultan was never supposed to come from merely, you know, one of the concubines' offspring. But anyway, but I think dynasty is sort of the default position in human history. As I talk about in history in my world history classes, you know, the Romans had a really hard time with this, because the Romans and the Greeks, for some strange reason I've never seen a good explanation for, did not seem to accept the hereditary principle. And, you know, the Romans' way of getting a new emperor was cutting the throat of the previous emperor for the most part. I mean, it wasn't, but I mean, getting off track. But in the Islamic world, the idea of particularly in the Sunni world, the idea of the ruler, you know, a dynasty, the ruler coming from a dynasty that is the same bloodline, became very normal. And it was also, as you point out, I think you were getting at this a minute ago and trying to clarify that a little bit, it became part of the religion, because there was certainly an idea, it seemed to have existed like throughout Islam in the early community, and although it split off and eventually became sort of fossilized in the Shia, there was the idea that the bloodline of Muhammad had special ability to rule, and that's really what Shiism is. But since Muhammad didn't have any sons that survived past infancy, and may have had one that died as a baby, despite having anywhere between, you know, 7 and 11 wives, depending on which sources you look at. The Shiite Ali, took their name from the faction of Ali. Ali was Muhammad's much younger cousin, who also married one of Muhammad's daughters, a woman named Fatima. So then the kids that they had, Hassan and Hussein, were the grandsons of the Prophet. And then the Shia all trace, and the different groups of Shia, of which there are at least three major ones, then trace who they think is the legitimate imam, that is, legitimate religious and political leader of the Islamic world, through these lines, through either the descendants of Hassan or Hussein. The Sunni didn't do that exactly. The Sunni basically said, well, after we get to the fourth caliph, Ali, it then becomes an issue of simply being a good Muslim. There were really sort of three criteria to be the caliph: being a good Muslim, being competent, as a ruler, and being able to lead the jihad. As long as you could do that, it didn't really matter. So people would seize power and say, hey, I'm a legitimate caliph now because I'm doing that. And the Shia idea of a religious dynasty got pushed off to the margins. Now, it's still believed by, I don't know, how many Shia are there? Probably 200 million, 250 million. But within the larger Islamic world of 2.3 billion, or not, excuse me, 1.8 billion, that's a minority. So, but that was sort of the religious dynasty thing, and the Ottomans had the more sort of mundane political dynasty thing, like we had in Europe and China and wherever else.
What are the differences between us and them, Western and Islamic, style religions? Is that we have our false messiahs returning, but it's a legitimate franchise. It appears in Islam, where I don't know, there must be over 15 of people that have come and made to enough people some kind of legitimate claim to be, the Mahdi come back from the cistern.
Yeah, well,
which makes it hard to rule a giant hunk of land when you're always got these messiahs coming back.
Yeah. So let me unpack that a little bit. Yes, basically, for those that don't know, Islam has a messianic imperative, as do all three of the major Western religions. Judaism has it too. It's just that Jewish messiahs haven't tended to cause as many problems as Christian and Muslim messiahs have. But even there, I mean, if you look at the vast scope of Islamic history and Christian history, it's much harder to claim to be Jesus' return, because the characteristics of that are pretty telling. Unless you float down from heaven and show nail hands in your side, you're probably going to have a hard time convincing people. It's happened a few times. Probably the biggest example of this was the Taiping Rebellion in China back in the 19th century, which is interesting because it has ties to what goes on in Sudan. The Taiping Rebellion was basically led by a guy, and again, I'm an Arabic linguist, not a Chinese linguist, so I'm not sure I'm saying this right, but a guy named Hang Xiquan, who was a Chinese Christian, because you had missionaries there such that there was a small Christian community by the 19th century, both Catholic and Protestant. And this guy seems to have been of the Protestant variety, and it was in southern China, and it also involved the island of Taiwan to some degree. And this guy claimed that he was Jesus's brother and sparked this messianic bloody revolt that went on for a number of years. And the Chinese, which was the Manchu dynasty or the Qing dynasty at the time, actually asked for help from the British. And you know who came and helped them? A guy named Charles Gordon, who at the time
no kidding,
a lieutenant colonel. Charles Gordon, who of course is famous in Sudan, who helped the Sudanese, the Ottoman Egyptian administration in Sudan, try to deal with the Sudanese method. So that's, but it's really hard. I mean, again, if you look at history, and my master's degree is in Christian history, my doctorate's in Islamic history, I think it's safe to say that there are far more people that claim to be the Mahdi than claim to be Jesus. And part of it is, and let me split that a little bit. The Mahdi is a belief. The Mahdi, M-A-H-D-I, means rightly guided or divinely guided one. It's a very strong belief in Islam, although it's not in the Quran. It's in the Hadiths, the alleged sayings of Muhammad. In both Sunni and Shia. Now, you brought up the Shia side of it. It is basically sort of it's a concrete doctrine in Shiism, particularly in Twelver Shiism of Iran, where they trace 12 imams going back to Ali, going back through the sons of his sons, like I said a moment ago, and there's these elaborate tables for which ones are the legitimate imams. But they believe that the Twelvers, who are the largest group, mainly Iran and Iraq, to a lesser degree Azerbaijan and Lebanon, believe that the 12th Imam, who is the Mahdi, was born, lived for a while on Earth, and then disappeared. Did not die, but disappeared. They call him the hidden Imam. And he will return at the end time as the 12th Imam, who will be the Mahdi. So for the Shia, the largest group of the Shia, for the Ayatollahs in Iran, the 12th Imam, when he comes back, will be the Mahdi. In fact, I was just working on a blog, Pete. I got to finish it a week or two ago in the Friday khutbah, the Friday sermon in Tehran. One of the Ayatollahs, I'm messing with my thing here because I keep hearing you and then you disappear. You can hear me okay?
I can hear you okay, yeah. And I'm also being quiet because the airplane flying over the tent.
I know. The 12th Imam, according to this khutbah, this sermon a couple of weeks ago by one of the Ayatollahs in Iran, when he comes back, which won't be that much longer, he's going to annihilate all the people of the West. So he's not exactly a kinder, gentler kind of guy. Anyway, but for the 12 Shia, the belief is that the 12th Imam was here and then disappeared. And it will come back toward the end of time. And then he and Jesus, who comes back also, who turns out he's a Muslim, will then make the whole world Muslim. Now, the Sunni believe in the Mahdi, but they don't believe it's the 12th Imam. They believe that basically, according to the Islamic traditions, some great Muslim ruler will emerge before the end of time. And people will sort of gradually figure out he's the Mahdi because he's like an Islamic Napoleon, I guess you could say.
Right.
And that's the kind of guys I talk about in the book. And that's the kind of guys that the Ottomans faced mainly. Because particularly the most prominent example was Muhammad Ahmad in Sudan, that the movie Khartoum is about.
Yes.
And this guy was a Sunni, and he basically decided he was a Mahdi. And
can I just I want to say something about this before we do, because I love this story and I think it's like the central piece of your book that I just really enjoyed. But as someone who's trying to run the Ottoman Empire, you have these like self-reanimating problems that are like, oh yes, that's right, I am the chosen one, and now I have to go on this almost predetermined path. Like I have to end up in Mecca and Medina and I have to do all these. I've got this list of things, and I'm not allowed to be the kinder, gentler Mahdi. I have to whack people. Like if I don't, I can't build my following. So these guys are like self-brutalizing. I mean, this is how I read it. I'm not the historian though. So is that sort of the problem for Turkey and Ottomans?
Yeah, because by definition, the Mahdi will wage jihad. And his jihad, according to the hadiths, will eventually encompass the whole earth. The whole earth will submit to Islam in the time of the Mahdi. And thus, in that regard, he will accomplish what Muhammad was unable to do in his lifetime. The Mahdi is not really a new prophet or anything like that. Some people try to say that. No, the Mahdi basically takes what Muhammad did and extends it to the whole planet. Of course, he has a little help from this guy named Jesus, of course. Because it's interesting in the hadiths, the Mahdi is sort of the global warlord, but there's a main enemy of the Mahdi. Again, we're talking in the sort of mystical, eschatological sense. The Mahdi has a main enemy called the Dajjal, the Antichrist figure. And as you can tell by the name, who do you think kills the Dajjal? It's not the Mahdi, it's Jesus. Jesus has special power to kill the Dajjal. Then the Mahdi kills the more sort of, mortal enemies of the Christians in particular, who are always the big problem from an Islamic expansionist point of view. So yeah, but yeah, you don't really get peaceful Mahdis. It's a contradiction in terms, because his goal is to take over the world. Now he takes over the world according to hadiths, both by jihad and by dawah. I mean, some people just convert because they say, oh, he's the one, but he clearly wages jihad. So you're the Ottoman Sultan. How are you going to deal with this? Well, you're going to deal with it the same way. But as I point out in the book, you can't deal with it just with kinetic operations, because there's a bunch of people are going, certainly Sudan people thought he was the Mahdi because he's winning all these battles. I mean, when they first started fighting the Egyptian forces, because Sudan was ruled by Egypt, it was sort of a sub-province of the province of Egypt, although part of the Ottoman Empire. His people were fighting with spears. Yeah. And then they win, and then every time they win, they like, oh look, here's these new things called rifles. Let's it's artillery. Figure out how to work this. So it's and it hasn't stopped happening. By the way, to say that real quick, get outside the scope of my book a little bit, but in 1979, the attempt by the group that occupied the Great Mosque in Mecca, led by Juhayman al-Otaibi, and he proclaimed that his brother-in-law was the Mahdi. And so the Saudis, you would think the Saudis would just laugh at this, but they actually had to have bin Baz and some of the senior clerics in the kingdom write fatwas to be published in the Saudi newspapers, like Okaz, saying, no, this dude's not the Mahdi, and here's why. And it's like they actually had to explain it to people, because people are going, maybe,
Yeah. So we have these problems in terms of trying to run an empire where you have these people that, and I don't know how long it takes for word to get from south of Sudan, to Istanbul, but it's not in a day. It's probably not even in a week. It's probably more than a week. And then you're like, okay, well, how many people are there?
Right.
Let me get him a horse and go find out. And then you know,
Right.
next thing you know, this guy's won 2 or 3 battles, and then you send your not big enough force because, like you said, are you going to fill space? Are you going to take provisions? How are you going to attack this thing? And the territory and the geography is such that you can get it wrong probably more often than you get it right in terms of how you choose to fight these things.
Yeah, and who did that was the British, because the British were trying to help the Ottomans basically with this issue, and the British got a number of forces routed. But as I point out, when they actually used their head with strategy and tactics and sent in trained troops instead of sort of half-assed trained ones under cashiered officers who had gotten commissions in the Ottoman army, they did quite well. But by the time Khartoum falls in 1885, it's like, and Matthew's got 60,000 men he can put into the field. The British got other stuff to worry about, and ultimately it's like, what's the strategic interest? I mean, it's technically part of the Ottoman Empire. The British had occupied Egypt in 1882, so they sort of were they occupied it and were like sort of pretending to still take orders from the Ottomans, but they were really kind of doing their own thing. But a lot of it was just dithering, and they probably could have stopped the Mahdi early on. Like as you picked up on, first they sent a battalion or two, and his men dealt with that. Then they sent a larger force, and every time they sent a larger force, he already had a much larger force. Plus, he knew the terrain. And every time he won, he got more people. Right? Every time he won, more people were convinced. Well, I wasn't sure about this guy, but he's beaten the Empire's forces. Maybe he is the Mahdi. I'd even point out that in terms of the the psyops or IO or whatever we want to call it against him, there was a prominent sheikh, a guy named Dahlan, who was over in Medina. And Dahlan, interestingly enough, I deal with this guy. He wrote stuff against not just the Sudanese Mahdi, but against the Wahhabis in Arabia. And I point out that he was, interestingly enough, in his writings, rather sympathetic to Muhammad Ahmed, the Sudanese guy claiming to be the Mahdi. He was not sympathetic at all to the Wahhabis. He hated the Wahhabis. Just thought they were pains. How dare they challenge the empire and that sort of thing. And this guy was an Arab, by the way, but he was loyal to the Ottoman state. But he writes about he's like, well, Muhammad Ahmed can't be the Mahdi, but maybe he's sort of a type of a Mahdi, and if he humbles the enemies of Islam, then more power to him. I mean, that's kind of his approach, which is kind of interesting. That was not the view of the Ottoman Sultan, by the way. He just thought he was a pain in the ass.
So when we have this story, we have this guy that gathers power. He's taking territory. He's dominating the Nile. We've covered all these things and how important something like the Nile is, because you just walk your way up to Alexandria and now you own pretty much everything within 100 miles of either side of the Nile at this point.
And that was the fear. That was the fear in Cairo that they would come north, and they might have done that, but Muhammad Ahmed died probably of malaria in June 1885. And so after that, it was like his successor, a guy that claimed to be his caliph called Abdullahi, basically was content to sort of rule Sudan, and probably was smart enough geopolitically. The Mahdi, Muhammad Ahmed probably, I think if he'd lived, probably would have said that they should invade Egypt. And in which case that probably would have brought down serious British power on them. So I think his successor Abdullahi was more sort of pragmatic, and it's like, I'm not going into Egypt. There were a few forays and incursions into Egypt, but he never went into Egypt in force. He actually spent more time fighting the Ethiopians, the Christian rulers in Ethiopia.
Right.
So because he realized, I think he realized, I don't know if he proved this, but this is my speculation. He realized that going north into Egypt, you're going to provoke the Ottomans to a major reprisals, or the British, or both, and you don't want to risk it.
And the British, for the most part, and this goes again to the counterinsurgency part of this, like how do you gather your partners and everything? They were desperate to not get involved in this fight. Like they did not want. They sent one dude down unarmed.
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
try and
Talk about a messianic imperative, right? Hey, Charles Gordon, can you go down there and take care of this stuff single-handedly for us? Yeah.
His second messianic takedown, and also including himself. And then, as we talked about offline, I would imagine that Gordon dying wasn't part of the Mahdi's plan. He probably is like, shit, and he didn't know he was going to die of disease months later. But what do you think he would have done though? Like, would he have gone north, or would he listened to his two and said, yeah, let's head over to, and then what would be next if you weren't going to, because everybody could be Hannibal, but it's hard to be Caesar.
Yeah. Yeah. You mean what would have happened if Muhammad Ahmed had lived?
Yeah, if he had lived and taken the advice, where would he have gone next to continue to amass power? If not, like, because it's tempting to go up to Alexandria and Cairo.
Yeah, very. But again, I think that would have been very risky, because you're going into Cairo was either the second or third most important city in the empire. Istanbul's one. You could argue maybe Damascus is two, or Damascus or Cairo is two or three, depending on how you want to argue about that. So the Ottomans would have had a problem with that, especially keeping in mind what had happened earlier in the 19th century when Muhammad Ali, or Mehmed Ali, the ruler of Egypt, if you remember, actually tried to take over the Ottoman Empire in the 1840s. He modernized the Egyptian army when it was still nominally part of the part of the Turkish state, but he eventually decided he was going to try and take over the whole ball of wax, and he was marching up through Anatolia, up through Syria, defeating the Ottomans in every turn. And who actually stopped it? The British.
Yeah.
Because the British they didn't want anything to happen to the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottomans are effective bulwark for them against whom? Against the Russians. Yeah. So I think it's unlikely that he would have gone into Egypt right away. I think what might have been very likely, one of two things, Pete. Muhammad Ahmed, when he was alive, had written letters to the Sanusi leaders in Libya. Now, the Sanusiya was a prominent Sufi order that basically ruled much of Libya. And actually, when Libya was created as a kingdom, as an independent state, the head of the Sanusi Sufi order was made the first king. King Idris was a Sufi, believe it or not, in this Sanusi order. And they were very famous for their abilities with jihad. Again, if anybody knows anything about Sufis, some people, there's this sort of misapprehension that Sufis were all a bunch of, like Quakers with beards, and they really weren't. The Sufis in the modern world tend to be peaceful and to be seen as non-jihadists, because the Wahhabi or the Salafi Wahhabi fundamentalists tend to attack them. But the Sufis, if you get nothing else from my book, but one thing is that the Sufis were often engaged in jihads, and in fact, much of the Ottoman state was run by Sufis, and they were fine with jihad. So Muhammad Ahmed had written letters to the leaders in Libya, the Sanusi leaders, saying, "Hey, join up with me." And the one, I forget which one it was at the time that he wrote the letter to, was not amenable to this, but probably there would have been some degree of sympathy for Muhammad Ahmed and for the movement, especially if he had lived, and again, having taken Khartoum and kicked out the British and everything.
Yeah.
So I think one way to get at Egypt would have been to go to the northwest and go around and sort of flank Egypt by trying to get control of Libya. The other would have been to go across the Red Sea and attack Mecca and Medina.
Yes.
That would have been the other thing. That would have really gotten Abdul Hamid's goat. It didn't take much to get Abdul Hamid's goat, but anyway, I think that would have been the other thing that they, especially considering that up in Sawakin and the Red Sea coast of Sudan, if you picked up on this, probably was where Muhammad Ahmed's most capable sub-commander was, a guy named Usman Digna, or Osman Digna, depending on if you want to do it Arabic or Ottoman. And this guy was very, very competent, and he probably would have been fully up to the task of figuring out a way to get across the Red Sea and attack Mecca and Medina.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to just say Aqaba, but you get to Aqaba and you just keep going. And the next thing you know, there's not a lot. If you can handle the movement across the desert, and then if you do get Mecca and Medina, you head towards Basra,
Yeah.
and then you're gonna have a fight with the Iranians. But there's a way to get to there, really pretty fast. I mean, it's the stepping stones are there, which is interesting because as the Turkish leadership is looking at these rebellions, these insurgencies, and everything, they're dealing with a lot of different people, religions, and everything. I mean, convincing people that a black dude was the Mahdi wasn't easy. I'm sure there must have been some what we would call racism today, but what they would just call "you're not us."
Well, that was part of the hadiths. Again, as I said, the belief about the Mahdi is nowhere in the Quran. It's in the hadiths, which are the alleged sayings of Muhammad, and there's like multiple volumes of these hadiths. And I point out specifically, like, I don't know, 10 or 12 of the hadiths that are adduced by the Ottoman clerics to say, here's why you're not the Mahdi. And They do say, you're it's interesting, they say you're Aswad, not Ahmar. You're black, not red. Because the hadiths say that the Mahdi will be from Arabia. And so they're like, well, you're not from Arabia. And I don't think it was so much racial. It was just simply just pointing out, you're from the wrong place. Nowhere is there a hadith that the Mahdi comes from Sudan. So,
He's like, give me a minute. I'll be from Arabia in about an hour.
Yeah.
So as we look at all these things, these problems, these uprisings that they're trying to put down, did they have a preferred means of doing it? Was it through, taking all the provisions? How did they, what was their best technique?
Oh my gosh. I don't know if I could say there was a best one. I think it depended on the situation. But probably, I use that paradigm. I think I don't know if you're familiar with it before or not, but I don't know, some people may be, from Archer Jones, a famous military historian, about you've got combat and logistic, raiding, or persisting ways. You either attack the other's forces, you attack his bases, or you deny him territory and take away his resources and that sort of thing. And you could, of course, do both, or you could do it separately. I think, although the Ottomans ultimately lost in Yemen, you can argue that, as I said, they were there all told for 159 years. They were there in the 1500s and 1600s. They eventually left, but they came back again in 1849 and stayed until just the eve of World War I. And I guess I tend to write that off ultimately as a loss for the Ottomans, but a lot of that loss had to do with something that was kind of out of their hands, which was the coming of World War I. Had World War I not occurred, the Ottomans might well have held on to Yemen. But I bring that up because I think, although, again, the fact that they stayed there for 159 years means they must have been doing something right. I mean, look at it. I mean, oh my God, how long have we been in Afghanistan now, Pete? I mean, too damn long. But, a couple of decades. Right. We're coming up on a couple of decades, and we think that's forever. I mean, the Ottomans were the first foray, like 80-some years, and then the second one, another 70 or whatever it was, 74, something like that. And I think what they did was they learned that the first time they were in Yemen, again in the 1500s and 1600s, it was basically mostly just kinetic operations. It was just smash. It was combat operations, combat raiding. When you could capture one of these Zaidi imams, you behead him. Which is what they did with the Wahhabis too. Which is often really effective in the short term. But in the longer term tends to create problems because it tends to engender as much resistance as it gets rid of. But in the second, when the Ottomans came back in the 19th century, so throughout the 19th century up until the early 20th century, and they came back in 1849, they came at it much differently. I mean, they weren't afraid. They were never afraid. The Ottomans are never afraid to use their military. I mean, that's clear, okay? But they did this whole thing with. And I think it did work for a while with, the old trying to win hearts and minds. They were building roads. I mean, there are no paved roads in Yemen. They put some paved roads in. They put schools in. They created indigenous forces in the Ottoman, not just military, but police made up of Yemenis. They tried to bring the people in and make them feel like they're part of the empire and not just, being occupied by a colonial power. They did what they did in other parts of the other Arab provinces of the empire, which was they would bring sons of rulers back to Istanbul to go to school. So, I guess you could see them sort of as hostages too, but they were getting an education.
Right.
So I think the Ottomans learned, again, and this goes to the thing, we sort of have this like one-dimensional view of the Ottomans in the West. They were, they're the guys with the turbans and the big mustaches besieging Vienna, or tearing down the walls of Constantinople and that sort of thing. And yeah, they did do that, but there was you don't just do that for 500 years and survive. You've got to be more nuanced than that. And a big thing that the Ottomans did in Yemen, and I point out, was that it's something I think we could learn from and our allies could learn from, was they were really good exploiting religious differences in Yemen. Mm-hmm. Again, in Yemen, you had basically three major groups. You had the Zaydis, who were five Shia, and then you had, I don't know what it was back then. We don't have demographic data. Today the Zaydis make up of the Houthis. The Houthis are the main tribe. The Zaydi make up about 40% population, and then the rest is mostly Sunni. Back then you had, there's about 5% that's another kind of Shia called the Ismailis, who were Semiter Shias, and they were a substantial population back then too, particularly up as you go up into what is now Saudi Arabia, around the town of Najran, the city of Najran. And then you had Sunni. So you had three major religious groups. And the Ottomans, except for a couple of governors that were real idiots and screwed up, the Ottomans learned how to get the Ismailis on their side. Right. So they would basically get the Sunnis and the Ismailis fighting against the Zaydis. And when they ran into problems was when they'd alienate the Ismailis with stupid tax policies, or sometimes you had these governors come in. One governor came in from Egypt, this Ottoman governor, and would basically kill the head of any family that he could find trumped up charges to bring against, and then appropriate their wealth. Yeah. Well, once the Ottomans found out about that, they put a stop to it because they weren't stupid. You don't rule like that. But the Ottomans are very skillful in Yemen at exploiting religious differences to their benefit among different Islamic sects, which I find very interesting.
One of the questions as I looked through the timeline was places like Cyprus and Malta were largely left alone by the Turks for a variety of reasons, whether it was the Venetians or whatever, but they didn't go after those islands. Is it just a capability that they didn't have? Because they went up to Vienna, so not much was stopping them,
Eventually they did go after Cyprus. And that was back in the 1600s. Yeah. I think part of it's that the Ottomans were primarily a land power. They had a not insubstantial navy, but I think a lot of it is just that they focused on land power. And I think part of it too might have been that, going in any naval expeditions into the Mediterranean is always fraught with danger because most of the Christian European powers have more powerful navies. And you don't know who you're going to bring down upon you if you do that. So a lot of that, the Ottomans were very skillful at diplomacy eventually, after the Reformation came along, the Ottomans were trying to play spoiler and work with, Protestants against Catholics. Okay. They were not stupid about this sort of thing. But I think a lot of it in the Mediterranean was just, as you point out, I think it was just that they didn't necessarily have the naval reach that the European powers did. And they were primarily a land power.
When you think about history, two of the main powers in that region, both had to deal with these problems of diplomacy, multi-religions, multi-ethnicities. Would you say was Rome better than the Ottomans, or would you say it was the other way around, or is that not even comparable?
I thought you were going to bring up the Holy Roman Empire, which of course wasn't holy and wasn't Roman, and it's sort of an empire.
No, just in general, like the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
Pax Romana.
Well, the difference there is that the Romans controlled the whole Mediterranean. They controlled all the the entire circumference of the Mediterranean. So I think that gave them abilities that the Ottomans didn't have. Because who's the main enemy to the Romans? Both in the not in the Republic, but in the Empire, and then the successor kingdom, the Byzantines. Their main enemy is to the east. right? I mean, they have non-state enemies to the north primarily,
Sure.
but the only state enemies are to the east in Persia, whether it's the Parthians, the Sasanians, or once Islam comes along, Islam is to that direction. But sticking with just the Roman Empire, yeah, they I think the big geopolitical differences, geostrategic difference would be they control the entire Mediterranean basin, as whereas the Ottomans only controlled whatever 40% of it or something, and that their main enemy is to the east. So there was never Persian power, whether Parthian or Sasanian, in the Mediterranean. You did have it in the Persian Gulf, and sometimes they would push over and even maybe reach the Red Sea. I mean, there were a couple of times the Persians managed to reach the Mediterranean, but the Romans always kicked them back. So that's different with the Ottomans, because the Ottomans' main enemies really are to the west. So there's a much greater degree to which the Mediterranean area is contested by other powers that the Romans didn't have. But I
It
was going
also
to say, Pete,
seems
if I may, let me say real quick, since I brought
yeah.
it up. I think another good analogy, though, to look at that is, or point of comparison, is the Holy Roman Empire, which was basically Germany, the German Empire, particularly under Charles V in the 16th century. So you've got this state in Central Europe that's the most powerful European state, and which borders, depending on how far its tentacles go down, the Adriatic and the Aegean. So, and all of the, like for instance, Venice was not part of that, but really, like the Battle of Lepanto really is, and primarily between the Holy Roman Empire and the Ottomans, although the other powers get involved. So I think there's just more sort of congruency there, because it was the Holy Roman Empire that was fighting the Ottomans when they tried to take Venice, for instance. So anyway, I just want to say that.
The other thing is that there's a lot of mountains as you go up towards northern Italy. If you can get through the Baltics, the Balkans, you got a chance at going further. But at some point, that's one of the reasons why Vienna is so hard, because there's so many places to get whacked. As you try to provision yourself there, it's just really, really tough. And then also you got to get across that Adriatic to do any kind of land invasion across water. And that's, those tools just weren't available back during the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, and the Ottomans are going to have longer supply lines, right? I guess, although we're pre-Napoleonic with this, the Holy Roman Empire and whoever's helping them, mainly the Poles or the Hungarians or somebody, it's going to have interior lines. It's going to make it easier for them, right? So, on the other hand, if you look at those sieges, I think a lot of it is, damn, the Europeans just got lucky, because, uh, the Ottomans,
Tim, are you stuck? Okay, well, it's getting loud on this end, so I'm just going to wrap this thing up. Everybody should go out and check out Tim's book. Here is the link. You can understand this history of the Ottoman Empire and how they handled coin. That's from 1416 to 1916, basically the dawn of World War I. And we'll have Tim on again soon. Tim's such a great guest. His knowledge and everything of the whole region. I hope you guys enjoyed how neat this was to talk about Islam and coin and governing a massive empire, and one that we don't get to talk about nearly enough. So just in general, thanks everybody for watching. I know Tim appreciates it. If you get a chance to go and buy the book on Amazon, that helps us. You can always go on Audible and get books that way. That also helps us. So if you want a link, let me know. I'm always glad to support. Thanks everybody for listening in. I know that Ottoman Empire study isn't the first thing on everybody's list, but I do know it's fascinating. So we'll have another show tomorrow. I will talk to you guys soon.